Could we make a start? Hopefully you are all fully refreshed and watered, and your blood sugar levels have recovered a little bit from the afternoon. We're going to talk now about how we can innovate our way to a flatter, faster, smarter government. And I assume everyone thinks that's better than being fatter, slower, stupider, and things which actually governments occasionally are around the world. But I'm sure no one in this room. And we have a fantastic panel to help us answer these questions. On the far right, Peter Ho, who at various points has run pretty much everything in Singapore, I think, and is now sort of reflecting as a guru. Professor Bekkers from Rotterdam, who from an academic point of view has thought deeply about these issues over many decades, and Elizabeth Linos from the Behavioural Insights team in North America, who's really at the forefront of doing radical innovation within governments. My name's Geoff Mulgan. I'm going to chair the session. I have probably a background somewhere in the past in British government. I used to run the strategy unit when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, have an academic post at Harvard, and now run a thing called NESTA, which is the UK National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. We work with about 20 governments around the world, including US, India, Brazil, European Union, and others. We're going to kick this session off, though, with a question from one of the Blavatnik MPP students, and hopefully it will be a question which will get us all energized and get our brains buzzing, fast, smart, and lean. So, Jose, would you like to come up and ask your question?
Thank you, Geoff. Thank you very much. My name is Jose Puyana. I'm from Colombia. I'm an MPP student here at the Blavatnik School of Government. This is a very interesting topic. I'm sure a lot to discuss and a lot to take away to our countries where we want to promote innovation. So if innovation means making efforts to transform the way in which societies approach their social, more entrenched problems, can we effectively promote innovation when our institutions have been created to resist change? Many states have built institutional frameworks based on certitude, stability, and routine. This is a part of the DNA of most public officials, risk-averse individuals that face conservative oversight institutions. How can we incentivize innovation amongst public officials in this context? Do we need to wait for a new generation of public officials, of less risk-averse individuals, capable of leading these changes, or can we do it now? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jose, and you'll get a chance at the end of the session to say whether you think anyone has answered your question adequately. But let's begin maybe with you Peter. So 19th century bureaucracy was almost designed to squeeze out unpredictability of any kind, and perhaps creativity too. Is there an inherent tension between our models of government and the need to innovate?
Well, I think if I look at it from a Singapore viewpoint, we were innovative almost from day one because we were put into a situation when we became an independent country in 1965, either to sink or swim. And then it became very important to ask ourselves what do we need to do, not just to survive, but to thrive in a world that was both competitive, changing very fast. So many of the things we did in the early days could be described as extremely innovative, which became models for other governments to look at in terms of policies, whether it is our superannuation policies, our housing policies, our investment policies. Now, once you become successful, though, then the question is, can you continue to innovate at that level? And I think there's a real challenge, because this is the challenge of success, not the challenge of failure, but the challenge of success. And governments then have to ask themselves, is the issue innovation at the government level, or is the issue to drive innovation through the private and the people sectors? And then how do you get the people in the private and the people sectors to innovate when they've, in Singapore's case, they've been extremely used to the government, in a sense, making all the big bets and making all the big decisions. So that's, I think, the situation we find ourselves in now. So it's a kind of opposite of the situation the gentleman asked for. But it is a very serious question because we are in an environment where things are changing very, very fast. And there's no way a government can be quick enough to embrace all these challenges and integrate them into a few big innovative bets. And I think in this kind of situation, you probably want to create an environment that allows some messiness, some failures, but on balance, success in the private sector, in the people sector. So that's my initial response.
And just one follow-up from me. When you were head of the civil service, did you want all of your civil servants to be innovating all the time, or did you want most of them most of the time doing what was proven to work with rather low appetite for failure? Well,
you have to be very practical about this. If everybody is innovative, you're in big trouble as well. You can't control it. So what you want to do is to make sure that the innovation takes place in the right places. And then you put the people who are most innovative in those kinds of positions, in those kinds of ministries or those kinds of agencies. The rest, just make sure that they do their job properly. Don't rock the boat. And there's a kind of bell curve. In any cohort, any group of leaders, there are people who are more inclined to try things out, who are prepared to take risks. There will be people who are quite prepared to just keep things going at a steady pace. And of course, you have your poor performers. But you have to take it as that. If you try to force the system to fit, everybody being innovative, it's not going to work. So that's what I try to do.
Yeah, Victor, over to you.
What you see also in, say, the research which I have been involved with, and I'm also at this moment carrying out, you see that one aspect or one factor is, say, the risk aversiveness of the administrative culture. But at the same time, you also see that when you look at the history of a number of public innovations, you can see that bureaucracy did play a very important role. For instance, look at the invention of the internet. Or if you go to the Netherlands, you can see, say, the water management works, which really put the sea aside so that we not have wet feet. But they were really invented by, say, bureaucracies. So there is something in terms of bureaucracy bashing, which put this claim of bureaucracy is frustrating innovation, to put it into perspective. At the same time, it is really important that within bureaucracies at certain spots, there is a kind of, that we really invest in terms of what is the learning capacity in those bureaucracies. And what can we do to create, say, a protected space in which there is room for trial and error. And there's also room to make failures. And one of the most important challenges is that increasingly bureaucracies are not allowed to make failures. Also in relation to all kinds of political and media pressure. So there is, it's also, I think, very important when discussing public innovation to look at also, say, the interaction between society, politics and bureaucracy.
And could you give us an example of a bureaucracy which is really good at failing and then learning from failure?
I think that when I look at, for instance, the Netherlands, at what is called, say, the water management organization, this has really a tradition of trial and error, etc. But they are politically protected to have this room, but also because for, say, the Netherlands, this water management issue is really a very important
There must be quite a low appetite for failure if you're going to flood the whole country.
Exactly, yes. but at the same time, the same time, we know that we have to look for new approaches and experiment with them in order to look for new solutions.
Okay, Elizabeth.
So from my perspective, innovation is happening in government all the time. It's just a very different image or understanding of what innovation is. So oftentimes we'll go into a local government or even kind of a large government department, and you'll always find a group of people that are smart, ready to change, not too risk averse. And they're making changes all the time. They just call them workarounds. And sometimes they don't tell their managers that they're doing them. And sometimes it takes an external force to come in and say, what you call a workaround that is making the lives of citizens better is actually an innovation. And let's harness that. Let's test it. Let's experiment on it and make it public. So maybe it's just about what we call innovation in government that's different. It's not going to be, and I would argue it shouldn't be, large-scale, very high-risk, very high-reward changes, but a culture of very incremental innovation that's ongoing and all the time. And I'm glad to hear that we've already started talking about trial and error because, it's no surprise that when there is a fiscal crisis, you don't have the option of not testing new things. You don't have the option of throwing money at a problem. And so, after the last financial crisis, we have seen a lot of governments more comfortable with testing new ideas and new approaches. And obviously, behavioral science and nudging has come out of that. We work in a bunch of mid-sized cities in the U.S. where the culture of trial and error has become relatively routine. And yes, the mayor's not going to talk about it as a failure, but failures are happening all the time on an incremental level, and that actually is making public services better.
So I'm sure we'll delve into this. There's a great virtue in experimentation and trial and get your mistakes in small scale rather than big scale. Most governments make their mistakes really big. But what do you miss out? So we had in the last session Mr. Kant from India. The UID, Aadhaar scheme in India is a really good example of a very big innovation which wasn't done through trial and error. It was a gamble. I think 1 billion people now with it. Are there any things of that kind you think government should be contemplating which are really big and can't be done in the way you've described?
So I think the two can go hand in hand. So one is really about setting a really high-level vision that is innovative, definitely, and high risk for the politicians that make that gamble. But how you go about operationalizing that within the public sector doesn't have to mean that every, as Peter mentioned, that every civil servant is making that gamble every day within their work. Of course, all major changes happen when a visionary leader, sets that tone and protects the people that innovate, beneath her. But I would argue that incremental change can be just as effective over time.
Okay. I want to turn a little bit to discuss technology, and it's a question I'll ask the panel, but also all of you. It's really about what would your priorities be for R&D in government itself? There's a real oddity that governments spend enormous sums of money on R&D for the military and for intelligence, but almost none have a proper R&D program for themselves. This morning, the Cabinet Office Minister in Britain launched a new data science strategy, and there's a lot of work on machine learning in government and so on. My question to you would be, what would the technological priorities of thinking 10, 20 years into the future, which emerging technologies have the greatest potential value for government, and how would you discover that value? And I'd be interested for your answers as well as the panel, but start with you, Peter.
Well, in my case, I think you just look at the big trends and ask yourself, what are the big trends? And these big trends will then tell you what are the big problems the government is going to confront. And in a place like Singapore, I would say it is things like urbanization. There are huge pressures in a small place like Singapore, 717 square kilometers, population still growing, demands for space for everything. And then you've got additional problems like an aging population. You've got problems like climate change, which means rising temperatures. How do you make cities livable in that kind of environment? So this is already clearly one big place where you should invest money in trying to find solutions. And that is, in fact, one of the things the government is putting money in. I think right now they've got something like $250 million invested in R&D programs. They call it Urban Solution Sustainability Program, to do R&D. And the R&D can be into things like how do you control the urban heat problem? How do you provide for increasingly elderly population that is that needs certain types of care, but you want to give them a meaningful life? So there are all kinds of issues which you can meaningfully invest R&D money in, and it is to address problems in the short to medium term. These are not blue sky research. This is money that is going to produce solutions relatively quickly. So I think it's not too difficult to dream up these kinds of prompts. I mean, I don't want to go into great deal of detail, but it's that sort of thing you can think about. And I think the big problems are very clear. I think they have to do with urbanization, they have to do with demographics, they have to do with climate change.
I think Singapore is very unusual in having this big investment at the moment in smart cities and sensors and experimentation. Victor, you were keen that we didn't only talk about technology, but I'm going to ask you the same question. So where would the technology big bets be for the next 10 or 20 years which will create most value for governments?
I think that this question is to some extent too broad for, say, talking in general, because you really have to look at what are the specific needs, but also what is the quality, for instance, of the technological or the academic infrastructure in a country. Because talking about big data science, it's very interesting, for instance, for Western European countries, but it also differs when we talk about Eastern European countries, or for instance, Greece or Africa. So I really think that we should really have this discussion on, say, also the level of the specific country and the needs of this country, also to prevent something which is also always very present when we talk about, say, all kinds of technological horizons, is that we build up a large program, and then a magnificent landscape is being painted at the end. And then you really have big expectations which very often fail. So I think it's very important to ask these questions, but at, for instance, the local level in relation to specific needs and challenges at, for instance, that local level, because technology as such makes a difference, but it's not really the substantive difference. It has really something to do how we bring together challenges, needs, and also all kinds of stakeholders to co-create relevant solutions which really address the needs of societies or the needs of citizens.
Okay, just a very simple question. Most countries spend a certain percentage of GDP on research and development, 4% in some cases, 2 or 3 or 1 in others. Should any of that be spent by governments on their own needs, or should that be 0? So about half the public R&D in countries like this one, or the US or Russia, is spent on the military.
Yeah.
Should any of it be spent on civil governmental needs?
We really should also spend it on civil needs. Exactly.
Okay, Elizabeth, yeah.
I mean, just to answer that last point, I don't think we all have the right to complain that government is fat, slow, and what was the other one? And stupid, if we're not willing to invest serious money into improving public management. And that means everything from seriously thinking about who we hire and how we hire them into government and who we promote, as well as how we give civil servants the tools to do their jobs better. So I think you have to pick one of those two. You can't have both. But more broadly, the question that you asked was, what should government be investing in? Look, we really haven't answered the question about inequality, and it seems like that's a question where the government has to play a role, either to think about solving the actual issue of inequality, but definitely its after effects when it comes to access to public services. So if I would pick one, I would shift some of that R&D money to that side.
Okay, one last question for the panel before I open up for your answers to these questions and your questions, and that's really about competencies and capabilities. And this question is partly prompted by work we've been doing with a few governments and with the OECD, trying to develop a framework of what are the competencies for 21st century public servants who are able to innovate, to use technologies and data, etc., etc. Where do you see the best practice in sort of building into civil service colleges, training schemes, assessment methods, as it were, the right attitudes and skills needed to do the sorts of things we've been talking about? Peter, you must have worked on this quite a bit.
Well, that's, I think, the core of the issue, because I think average person doesn't like change. So anything to do with innovation obviously implies change. And so how do you get the people, not just the people to innovate, who then have to think of changing things, but how do you get the people at large, that means the civil servants, to be comfortable with this change? Otherwise, you could have just passive resistance, and they will not be very helpful in implementing the changes that are needed. So I think that is a very critical part of it.
You implied earlier that you sort of tested to find who were the innovative people, and you
Yeah,
put them in
that's
particular parts,
Yeah.
and the people who were maybe a bit more sort of linear, predictable.
So if you are in that kind, and I think all organizations are a bit like that, you must then make sure that the whole system, even if they're not the innovators, are not going to resist change. And so you have to get the group as a whole, that means the whole bureaucracy, comfortable with the idea of change. And so it becomes something of a bit of an effort at changing the mindset of the whole organization. And how do you do that? You can't just say, oh, don't resist change, embrace it. It's not going to happen.
Be creative.
You be creative, it's not going to happen. They must internalize it, they must feel it. And so one of the things we did some years ago, recognizing this as a problem, was an effort called PS21, Public Service for the 21st Century. And that you could describe as a mass movement. Just empower people to make small changes at their level. If you've got a suggestion, make that suggestion. The organization is obliged to look at your suggestion and to tell you why it can be implemented or why it cannot be implemented. Or they organize into small groups to address smallish problems. But that is part of the system of helping people to internalize not just what change is about, but why change is valuable. Then when you make the big changes, there's less likelihood that they're going to resist it. So you have to think about this sort of thing as a holistic problem and look at not just how the change is made or what the change is, but how we're going to implement it. So implementation is a very big part of getting successful innovation.
Yeah. And I mean, PS21, which has now been going quite a long time, but it is a very interesting mix of a very horizontal networked approach and a very hierarchical one, and it's the combination which seems to work. Victor?
Yes, I agree with your observation, but I would like to make an additional comment, which you very often see nowadays in public sector innovation, is that public sector innovation is the result of a collaboration between different government organizations, the private sector, but also all kinds of civic organizations or citizen initiatives. And collaborative innovation also asks for a specific type of leadership, a kind of leadership which I call linking leadership. Because what is very important in collaborative innovation is that you have people who are able to link mindsets. They are able to link resources, to make free resources. They are able to link, say, for instance, the public management realm to the political realm. So linking leadership, I think, is very important in nowadays public sector innovation and should really be on the program of public management and public policy management courses. What are the competences to create this kind of linking leadership?
Yeah. This is a very big issue in parts of Europe which don't have any money. How do you get the skills to mobilize resources beyond your own money, staff, etc.? Elizabeth.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't think we have a better example than Singapore about who's done this well in terms of the civil service. One thing that I've been thinking about a lot is whether or not we've basically done a disservice to the world by emphasizing public service motivation as kind of the key component of being a government worker, at least in a lot of the West. I think that's been a disservice because there are so many other skills that you need to be a good government worker, and it's really hard work. And if we don't present it as such, we either get people who come for 2 years, are really idealistic, and then leave because they can't handle the bureaucracy, or you're just recruiting a very different set of people. We've seen the shift in kind of the humanitarian sector where, 20 years ago, everyone would just say, great job, you're helping the poor. And now we demand a level of professionalism and evidence in development. I'm not sure we've made that shift yet for the civil service, but I'm hoping that we will.
Okay, thanks for those great comments. I'd like to open up now to either your answers or your questions, and maybe some argument as well, because often creativity and innovation comes out of disagreement. We've got lots of argumentative people putting their hands up, which is very good. I'd urge you keep your comments quite brief, and the more specific or concrete, the better, with real examples. Maybe we could start over here, and I'll take a whole batch together.
Hello. I was interested in Elizabeth's comment about political nervousness about failure. And I was thinking of the agile principle of fail fast. So how do we help politicians become comfortable? Because this is an understandable fear of failure. So is it that we need to educate the media about digital disruption and, say, the possible need to fail fast?
But presumably a lot of the experiments you're talking about are almost below the radar of politics. The politician doesn't need to have publicly committed to them as being a success yet.
Yeah, there's two things I've tried. I'm sure within this room we can come up with 10 different ways of approaching this. One approach is to say, I understand politics, so I'll give you a success. So let's try the low-hanging fruit first. Let's experiment on something that we're comfortable with, which is, again, under the political radar. Maybe we don't start with a top priority. The other approach is to say you don't have another choice. And this is so urgent, and if you don't experiment, you're not going to move forward. So I don't think it's by chance that, when BIT first became famous, it was on revenue collection. That made the concept of experimentation interesting to people who don't care about experimentation and innovation, because once you say, look, in a time of fiscal crisis, with experimentation, we can bring in, $300 million in revenue in a year, that really changes the conversation. So one approach, they're almost diametrically opposed. One approach is to say, let's try it on something easy first. Let's do 10 experiments at the same time, because some of them will work and you'll have your success story to talk to the media about. The other approach is to say, this is so urgent, if you don't do it, you're already failing.
Yeah. Let's get the mic to next person. And there was a whole batch of speeches by Roosevelt in the 30s, which were the second model, where he said, we've got mass unemployment, it's a disaster, we've got to experiment, and we're bound to fail, but it would be an abnegation of responsibility not to innovate. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Silvana. I'm here as a student at the Blavatnik School of Government. I would like to know your opinion on who should assume the leadership. Should it be the government trying to promote the industry to generate innovative options and solutions to their problems, or should it be the industry to creating the leadership in innovation and then adapted by the government? And I'm asking this because as a former diplomat of Colombia in Germany, I see two different approaches. The German government is very innovative, and it's the German industry, is very innovative, and it's promoted and financed mainly by the government. While in Colombia, it's the other way around, and it's the industry who's trying to promote innovation and the government trying to adapt it in a way.
Could you be a bit more specific on a field? Because probably the answer will vary depending on what field.
I actually want to know in innovation in general, innovation policy.
But in your head, is there a particular topic, or?
Not really. I've just a general idea. Who should assume the leadership?
Okay, we got two people here wanting to ask questions, starting there.
Thank you. My name is Edison Bros. I'm from Panama. My question is sort of related to Silvana's one. Who is called to innovate? And I want to refer to the experience of my country. Public servants, for example, have a legal constraint. Public servants cannot do more than what the law tells them to do. Should it be public servants or should be the head of the entities? And if so, how do you reconcile these legal aspects with the nature of bureaucracy?
So
One minister,
give us an example of where you're therefore not allowed to innovate.
for example, you have a role and you can only do what the law tells you to do. If you do something else that is not on the law, you can be sued by somebody. Even if you did something right or if you did something wrong, you can be sued by somebody because you went beyond your duties. So how do you reconcile that? And should it be the head of the government or, sorry, the head of the entities, or should be a specific department within each ministry, for example, in charge of innovation? On bureaucracy, you definitely have different constraints. A minister has to attend meetings, has to go to conferences, has to do so many things. Where and who should be called to innovate?
Yeah, okay, so we've got another sort of leadership question. I'll take one more just behind you. That there used to be, I think it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire had a medal for officers who turned the tide of battle by disobeying orders. And Britain tried copying that about 20 years ago with legislation which empowered teachers to disobey the law in order to create a progressive innovation. So there are attempts at answering your question over many centuries. But let's take one more.
Thank you very much. I'm coming from Open Science Foundations, and we are probably one of the biggest philanthropic enterprises that support civil society. And there was lots of talk about civil society being engaged in innovation. And I really have a dilemma about this in different contexts. In particular context I'm coming from is Central Eastern Europe, which is a little bit of a gray zone. It's not the region where we see totalitarianism in its crude form, but we see totalitarian tendencies. And it is not fully fledged and super developed region of democracy. So there we see, for example, EU funds being used to co-opt the civil society by the governments, so they decrease their critical voice. And we know that innovation doesn't always happen in collaboration. It very often happens in confrontation. So you have the weakened civil society by the governments, by the taxpayers' money. So of course this exchange cannot happen between the civil society and government. So I wonder what's your view comparing this to your experiences?
Okay, let's take, well, there's a whole batch of questions, but I'd be interested to maybe start with you, Peter, both on the leadership question, but also civil society. You mentioned bringing civil society into the innovation process in Singapore. You traditionally have such a strong and effective state, it's been quite difficult for civil society to sort of find its place and its voice. So how do you answer this?
I think, in a sense, I'm going to try to touch on the three questions which were raised by making a distinction between government, which is the public sector, and governance, which is how government relates to both the private sector as well as the people sector. So, I mean, this is, to me, quite a central question today because of the nature of how society is evolving and the limitations of government in being able to respond to the very complex or wicked problems that are emerging. So if you talk about questions of innovation, government itself clearly cannot innovate. So they need to find some balance between government facilitating innovation and getting the private sector or the civil society to innovate. Now this means a different type of relationship between government. It's no longer it's a top-down. The government says you do this and everything will be all right and we know what is best. In fact, I think problems are getting so complex that innovations need to be done in partnership. So you need to have conversations with the private sector, with the people sector. In Singapore, we've tended to do the conversations with the private sector much better than we have done conversations with the people sector. But now the imperatives of societal change are compelling the Singapore government to have very serious, in-depth conversations with the people sector. So just a couple of years ago, they had this huge thing called Our Singapore Conversation, which is about, I think, something like 300 separate conversations. Anybody can join. Any Singaporean who says he's got a view can join, and he can talk about anything under the sun. And something like 60,000 Singaporeans indeed did sign up for these 300 conversations, and we were able to narrow down the issues to things of great concern to the people: housing, education, transport, and health. And to the credit of the government, it did start to make changes to their policies as a result of these conversations. So increasingly, I think you're going to see a lot more of this happening. And if you don't do this, and if you don't take this approach, then you can be sure that people will make their dissatisfaction heard, either at the ballot box or through the social media. So I think increasingly we are not talking so much about government, we are talking about governance, and government learning how to engage more systematically with the private and the people sector, whether it's innovation or whether it's addressing some of the issues which people feel very strongly about.
If any of you have the appetite to go to Madrid next week, we're actually hosting a big event of all the democratic innovations across Europe, which are trying to embed that sort of process into city management in, so Madrid, Barcelona, Helsinki, and other cities. None in the UK, I'm afraid, but actually using digital platforms for a much more sort of ongoing policy proposal, commentary process in government. In the Netherlands, is civil society over-co-opted? Has it been neutered by being brought into the process?
No, but it really, what is interesting is if when you look from a comparative perspective on innovation processes in Europe, as I do in my project, is that the state and governance traditions of countries really matter. Yeah. And that also have important implications that if you talk about, say, innovative concepts in terms of city labs, which are very well flourishing in Helsinki and really reach out to people, you have to ask the question, what is the dominant state tradition in Bulgaria or in Romania? And how do politicians or the state see citizens or civic society? So this is really important to address this issue. And if you want to have a change in that, you can have two options. Either one, a more bottom-up approach. The other way is when you're trying to look at, for instance, insights that come from more policy dynamics, literature and research, that you see, okay, perhaps, for instance, to involve more citizens in public sector innovation would perhaps create something, or needed, what is needed is something of a more fundamental policy change or a policy paradigm which has to be changed. And that really asks, deals with questions like dominant coalitions, with policy windows, agenda setting, those kind of issues which really are at the background of, say, the management of public sector innovation, but which are really have to address when talking about innovation.
Okay. Could you comment on the leadership question? Where should the leadership come from?
On innovation?
Yeah.
It's a good question. I wish I had the answer. My sense is that it is too much of a burden on any one player to say you're in charge of innovation. Someone mentioned before, should we have kind of innovation units that are people whose job it is to innovate and then everybody else can get on with their day job? Even that, I think, is too much of a burden. I think the leadership has to come from people. Of course, we should be opening up government to civil society to support innovation, not only in terms of transparency and accountability, but also in decision making. The question is how. And I think there's good news and bad news. The good news is, once you start the process of open government, it's very hard to pull back. So I used to work for the Greek government under Prime Minister Papandreou. a lot of changes can happen once a new government comes in. One thing you can't pull back is open government, right? So once one politician says, I'm going to put up all the policies online and everybody can comment, it's very hard to take that right away. So that's a good thing. The bad thing is we don't know how to take the next step. So it's not obvious that just by opening up government or creating more apps or putting things online or creating a platform is actually engaging the right people. It's engaging different people. So some people show up to town halls and some people show up to the online forum. It hasn't really solved the problem yet. And I think maybe we need to spend more time thinking about what actual meaningful engagement means. If I could take one more moment on that point, I know I've been speaking a while. We've been speaking about trust all day. And I think part of the reason these things haven't worked so well is because people are either providing ideas that would never work, and civil servants know that. So they don't trust that civil society can come up with good ideas. And in exchange, citizens say, look, I've tried giving my opinion and no, it never gets heard. There's a line of research that's coming out now that says, quite simply, if you open up government to how government works, people begin to trust government more. So in the same way that when you order a pizza and you have a little tracker that says, like, now they're making your pizza, and now it's getting into a box, and you feel like someone's working on your behalf, there's some great innovation in the public sector which says, now we're filling out your pothole. Look at me filling out your pothole. And that's creating trust in government and a willingness to engage. And I think that's super promising.
And if you're interested, part of what we're showcasing next week in Helsinki actually is pioneered, I think, these open APIs where you can get the link so you are kept informed every stage of a decision-making process. And I think that does transform government. I'm going to take two quick votes. Very crude ones, but if you could bear with me to ask you two questions. So the first one is, on balance, do you think the world's governments, public sectors need more innovation than they have now? Just a show of hands. If on balance you think they need more, and, okay, thank you, and who thinks they need less? One person. Okay, we'll come back to you in a second. Second question, who in this room thinks on balance government should be better at implementing tried and tested evidence-based policies and programs? Show your hands up. And who thinks they should do less evidence-based policy? Okay, two people. And who thinks there's a contradiction between the two positions you've just taken? Nobody. Okay, that's fine. Well, why did you disagree the first time around?
Well, perhaps I can relate this to a question I wanted to ask anyway.
Good.
Any form of organizational or technological change in government is likely to give rise to a various and diverse range of modernizations in government. This is actually a direct quote from Christopher Hood, 1998. I think that government perhaps already has too much innovation in the sense that we are trying to cram too many innovations into an organizational context where it's perhaps not fitting. I think that innovation in government relates to strong cultural worldviews that arise from the interaction between incoming innovations and existing structures. And therefore, there may be very, very different forms of acceptability of technology. And so if, for instance, some public administration scholars would tell us there are actually 4 different forms of acceptability of technology. The first one that has here been identified...
Briefly, please.
All right, sorry,
Very briefly.
I didn't mean to give a lecture.
Yeah,
The first one would be the trial and error approach. A second one which would be innovation within very, very small spaces. The third one would just say, oh, any kind of innovation is too dangerous, we are not going to do that. And the fourth one would say, oh, any kind of innovation doesn't make any difference because it only reproduces already existing processes. And so actually I want to relate this to the question, to what extent do you think can we transfer innovations across different public sector organizations and perhaps even across countries? Perhaps if I may give a short example.
No, I think we've got very short on time. So I'm going to use your question then to open up the technology issues, which none of you have actually responded to. So there's a lot of emerging technologies, machine learning, blockchain is probably the most talked about one. At this time last week I was in Moldova, where they were talking about using blockchain in government. How should governments go about making the most of emerging technologies like that? And will their responses be very different depending on culture, as you've said? And should they have R&D programs? Does anyone, a techie expert, want to comment on this? No? Okay. All right. And none of you think governments should have their own sort of R&D programs to mine emerging technologies for usefulness?
Daniel Thornton from the Institute for Government. I mean, my overall feeling is that in relation to technology, government should primarily be setting the standards and creating frameworks for innovation rather than trying to innovate itself necessarily. And if the public sector is well managed, and I think this comes to the flatter point, which we haven't talked about so much, then I think it will be more porous to innovations elsewhere. So I think if you can create, I think, what was it, PS21? That was that we were talking about. I think that sort of thing is what allows the public sector to be porous to technology, and so it's establishing management frameworks and the kind of, you know, what comes after new public management as a sort of, you know, way of thinking about how the public sector is managed, that allows you to take benefit from the technologies rather than the government saying, you know, we're going to pick winners and decide that this is the latest, greatest technology.
Okay, let's get some comments or questions from this side of the room. I mean, the slight counter to that position is therefore governments will inevitably have the kind of handoffs from business or military innovation. They won't have ones actually suited to their own needs. But yeah, do you want to, both of you? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Teddy. I'm an MPP from the Blavatnik School. My question is just how well you think governments operate at sharing innovations and lessons learned and best practices across, whether you see, you know, individual cities and states coming up with innovations and then it taking 10 years to filter to other jurisdictions, or whether governments are getting better at that.
Do you want to, I mean, you're an example of a horizontally spreading innovation.
Sure.
Have you been helped by any existing institutions to do that? Or was it organic?
Well, so there's two answers. The first is it's really hard, and this is a question that we get all the time, which is how do we even get, you know, within the government, how do you get departments to speak to each other? I'm gonna point to something that was said earlier in the keynote about India, which is rank, and rank them publicly. We found that it's very effective to kind of leverage that peer network. So city managers really care what other city managers are doing, and they have a very strong sense of who they're competing against in a way that I didn't expect when I first started working in cities. So the easiest way to get innovation in Chattanooga, Tennessee, is to tell the mayor that the Louisville mayor already did it. And to say that publicly. Now, is that the best strategy? I'm not sure. Do I believe there's a behavioral component to how we create social comparisons and how we rank people? Of course. But it's not the case, which is what I used to think, that governments don't trust anything that hasn't happened kind of organically. There is a thirst for best practices. And Geoff, if I can answer your initial question about kind of the contradiction. If we had good evidence about what works in all of the areas, of course we should be using it. Unfortunately, we're still really early on in the game in terms of creating that evidence.
And Peter, I mean, Singapore's in the past been very hungry to learn from other places, and then others have learned from you. But when you look at other governments around the world, do you think it's career threatening for people not to copy really good practice in the way that in the private sector, if you don't copy successful competitors, you just go out of business?
I don't think it is an issue of copying, it's an issue of looking around and adapting. Because I think many think that it is just, you know, whatever the other guy does which is successful, therefore it can be implemented. In fact, that is almost fatal, that's almost guaranteed to make sure that it's not going to work. What you need to do is to look at what is happening, why it's succeeding, and understand the societal and other contexts that make it a success. And then you look whether it can apply in your context. So Singapore goes, as you say, around the world, we look at best practice. But best practice doesn't mean it's copied blindly. We adapt and we say, well, certain parts make sense, and we may not implement it fully. So I think that is very critical. It's a very practical and pragmatic approach. So it would be foolish to try to reinvent the wheel, but in trying to copy the wheel, make sure that wheel is designed for your terrain and whatever other special conditions apply. I think too many just copy blindly, and that's where a lot of trumps, a lot of disappointments come in.
There is a phenomenon which I'm sure some of you will have experienced of repositories of best practice being created. A lot of money at the moment is going into some of these which gather literally thousands of supposedly proven models, but they nearly always then discover that no one uses them. So maybe another question to anyone here is what's the answer to that? Because it's one of those things which is endlessly repeated and always with the same experience. But you've got a question first.
Thank you. My name is Zara. I'm also a student on the Master of Public Policy here. So my question is related to organizational behavior and culture. You've spoken about certain sort of tips and tricks that can make people innovate. Of course, we don't want innovation for innovation's sake. We want it for effectiveness. So my question is, I worry that there'll be certain pockets of good practice or pockets of innovation, but if you're looking at a civil service as a whole, how do you enable a cultural change?
Victor, do you want to comment on that?
I think that it's very important that that there is a civil service in which people go around. So also that for sometimes people, or for instance managers, are appointed in one specific agency and then another agency, so that they also can learn on the spot about, say, innovation experiments which are present in one specific domain, and then they are going to ask themselves, okay, what does this imply for the domain I'm now working on? So in terms of mobility is I think very important, and what is also very important is that there is within the civil service a kind of group of people who are, say, the ambassadors or the advocates of innovation, especially scanning for new ideas, new solutions, etc. That is one. And the other one is that it also, I think, very important to have they have something of a kind of systematic attention within the civil service, not being perhaps in terms of all kinds of big programs, but systematically organizing attention for the need to innovate, for the need to change, but also to look at, for instance, foreign practices.
In a moment, I'm going to give you each a chance to have some final comments, but we've got a question here.
I'll just shout.
Shout.
Jeff, can you answer your own question? John McDermott from The Economist.
Mm.
I just want to hear your answer to your question.
Which one?
About technology. Which applications of technology are you particularly excited about? I mean, you travel the world, see these different governments.
Well, personally, I'm very excited by what's happening with AI and machine learning, which is beginning to be used on the edges of government, particularly healthcare, a little bit in criminal justice, but I think needs much more systematic R&D and experiment, etc. And blockchain probably has had massive overhype in some respects. We're running various projects on non-financial uses of it in law, potentially in democracy, and again in healthcare. And nobody knows, but there's a potential those will achieve really radical advances in how government operates, reducing corruption, reducing transaction costs. So there's two where, at the very least, a lot of investment and experiment should be happening now, and it's only through doing that that you'll discover if there are good answers at the other end. Yeah.
Dinesh Kapoor, I'm also an MPP student here at the Blavatnik School. Innovations often tend to happen in areas like my city or my public transport or my neighborhood when in relation to government. I'm trying to understand if that hypothesis would be true, if somebody would say that innovations in the healthcare system or the tax system or the education system are slightly removed from people. And is there some effort that governments, in your experience, have had to make to sort of bring people closer to those innovations?
Have you seen a good example of that?
Cities. You're talking about Helsinki, Barcelona, for instance, is a city that has lots of smart city innovations. But yet, often countries complain about innovations in healthcare or in the tax system. So you see innovations in cities, but it takes time for them maybe to come in bigger systems.
Okay. I'll let each of you, you can say whatever you like, but some final comments. I'd particularly like you, Peter, just to, and maybe Victor as well, just to answer whether you think governments are actually flatter and faster than they were 20 or 30 years ago. I'm not sure there's any evidence they are actually flatter in terms of numbers of levels, but since that was our question, and are they actually faster? It relates to your question of how quickly ideas are developed. Are they faster, or is it like science, which has actually become slower in the last 30 or 40 years? The time it takes to complete a science project is much longer than it was a generation or two ago. So is government more like sort of the digital startup world, or is it more like, I don't know, CERN and big science? Peter, you'd like to have some concluding remarks. You can ignore everything I just said if you want, but...
I think governments should be two-speed. That means there should be parts that move faster in response to problems that are in front of us. But I think there are longer-term issues that require governments to take a more deliberate effort to engage people, to engage the citizens, to engage the private sector, to talk about these issues, because the success of these plans is not just how good the policy or plan is, but how much these plans are accepted and embraced by the citizens, by the private sector. So that means it's almost, by definition, a slower process. But if you just force it as a mandate from heaven, then you're going to get pushback, you're going to get tissue rejection, then you've got a problem. So it's almost as if you have this contradiction. You have a government that in normal things you expect it to move fast, but when it starts looking at some of these emerging problems, these emerging challenges, it takes a more deliberate approach to consult, to talk, to dialogue with all kinds of people to ensure that they have a much higher level of assurance of acceptance.
Yeah, and the complaint sometimes made is that governments do fast what should be done slow and do slow what should be done fast. Victor?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because I think on the one hand you see that the general opinion is that it is not flatter and faster, but if you, for instance, look from an historical or an empirical perspective, and you compare, for instance, the time it took to fill in and to come back, say, your tax assessment, and I look at, for instance, at the Netherlands, I now see that in most of the cases, people have in, say, 3 months' time, they know what kind of taxes they have to pay. If you compare it with, for instance, 20 years ago, it took a year. So if you look at, and especially also when looking at the role of technology in service delivery processes, you really can say that it has become faster. In terms of flatter, I'm not sure, but because you see that a lot of government agencies have been large, also in terms of agencies, but there is another contraindication which also can be witnessed, is that you see that government agencies increasingly collaborate with each other across their organizational boundaries, and which is also facilitated by the use of information and communication technology. So it has become more, say, it has become more organic than the connotation of flatter in terms of fragmentation. Yeah.
So I guess I can talk about anything. So I'm going to assert something, and hopefully, if I say it enough times, someone will believe it to be true. I think there is a lot of innovation happening in government, and I feel like we should all be optimistic about where that innovation is happening. From the behavioral science perspective, we've seen a lot of change that is kind of outward focused or citizen focused. So governments innovating to get citizens to do something, to pay their taxes, to engage with a service, to write things online. I think the next kind of generation of behavioral science innovation in government has to be turning inwards and saying, how can we improve our own services? And given the conversation that we've had here today, I would urge us to not think of that as navel-gazing and not think of that as not the purpose of government, because it is actually fundamental to how we serve the public, how do we get the services that citizens expect of us. And that means innovating and testing and using behavioral science to get the culture to shift or to change how we give feedback or how we share best practices. So I'm going to assert it, and hopefully if other people say it, it will become true. The next thing in innovation is going to be internal government innovation.
Okay. Jose, you have almost the last word. Has your question at the beginning been answered? I suspect it probably hasn't, but over to you.
Well, I think the question was addressed and it was partly answered, so I think I can say I'm satisfied. It was a great discussion, very exciting to know that we can be optimistic around the idea of innovation, and the panel showed that there is some sort of consensus, at least around the following 4 or 5 ideas. I'd say, first, most public policy scenarios face complicated, wicked problems that require innovative solutions. Second, although incremental change is possible, we should promote innovation and, I'd say, put our money where our mouth is and invest, as it was said, serious resources in R&D for government innovation, or as you said, for governments should invest in themselves. And innovation will not come without an effort and with motivated public officials. So that is, I think, a clear idea. And there was a very interesting consensus as well, is that we should make sure that the whole system, if at least not everyone should be innovating, the whole system should not oppose innovation. And it was said, actually it was very interesting, people should internalize it and they must feel it. I think it was a very interesting phrase. In my personal opinion, I've been working for many years in the public service in Colombia, and for example, anti-corruption frameworks create fear in public officials, and that fear obviously reduces incentives to innovate. So that sort of contradiction is somehow it's creating an obstacle for innovation. And finally, innovation is usually a product of collaborative relations. This requires a certain type of leadership, what we could call a collaborative leadership, people able to link resources, people, efforts, and, as was said in one of the questions, look at best practices as well. And government cannot innovate by itself. So it should talk to private sector, to the civil society, and come up with ideas through this conversation. So I think those were some of the consensus.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose. Thanks for the question and for the summing up. I think we are just over time, so I'm not going to delay things any longer. Just to say maybe one comment, final comment, which is, I think, implicit in all this conversation are the complementarities of two actually very different, or apparently different approaches. One is encouraging more creativity, more experimentation, but doing it small scale, doing it fast, doing it without, if you can, massive risk, and wherever possible involving people from civil society or business in the creativity. But then combining that with much more attention to evidence and actually acting on what is known about what works and what doesn't work. And those are almost opposite cultures, but when they come together, they give you, hopefully, flatter, faster, much smarter government and better results. And we just need governments which can keep two contradictory ideas in their minds at the same time, which someone, I can't remember who it was it F. Scott Fitzgerald said that was the definition of an intelligent man, was the ability to
hold two conflicting ideas
in your head at the same time.
At the same time, without going crazy.
Without going crazy. So on that note, could you join me in thanking our panel for helping us not go crazy? Another session now.